أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين يا حي يا قيوم برحمتك أستغيث رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. Today I will be speaking about the philosophical foundations of neuroscience. In fact, that is the exact text I'll be using today. And previously I have spoken about perception and vision and also broken down some concepts regarding the visual cortex, striate cortex, the V1, ocular dominance columns, and various other systems that exist within our day-to-day behavior, such as decision and habitual systems. Today we'll be expanding from a philosophical angle on sensation and perception, and also understanding some ayahs of the Qur'an that I found extremely fascinating in this realm of my studies. So before we begin, we must define sensation and perception, and in the most appropriate fashion, that would be to see how the APA defines it, which is the gold standard, unfortunately, for the world at the moment. So, sensation, the process or experience of perceiving through the senses. Number two, an irreducible unit of experience produced by stimulation of sensory receptor and the resultant activation of a specific brain center, producing basic awareness of a sound, odor or color, shape or taste, or of temperature, pressure, pain, muscular tension, position of the body, or change in the internal organs associated with such processes as hunger, thirst, nausea, and sexual excitement. Number three, in the structuralism of Edward Bradford Titchener, one of the three structural elements of mental experience, the other two being images and feelings. Number four, in general usage, a thrilling or exciting experience. Adjective, sensational. So this is a very standard and very basic definition. Now let's see perception. Perception is defined as sensation plus accruing secondary sensations and secondary images which appear in association with sensation through the influence of mental set. Now, there is a huge debate in science regarding nature versus nurture and how it can be settled. Different theories have been posited, different ideas have been put out there. However, there is no one unified theory, a universal agreement, so to speak. In any case, we'll see how the philosophy of neuroscience seems to address the main aspects and expand on certain phenomena that we may not contemplate at the level that they have. So, chapter number 5. Sensation, bodily feelings distinguished into sensations and feelings of overall bodily condition. Among the manifold powers that human beings possess, we can distinguish the passive power, susceptibility or liability to have bodily feelings, from the perceptual powers of the five senses. Bodily feelings can be roughly distinguished into sensations, which are localized feelings such as pain, tingles, tickles or itches, and feelings of overall bodily condition such as feeling well or ill, awake or sleepy, seasick or nauseous, fit or weak. The latter merge with feelings of overall psychological conditions such as tranquil, contented, dissatisfied, bored or interested. We shall concentrate on sensations, construed narrowly to encompass only localized feelings, rather than on feelings of overall bodily condition, even though the latter are also sometimes misleading, referred to as sensations, as we speak of sensation of well-being. So, for instance, when we say to another person, I sense an air of dishonesty about you. What do we mean? I sense an air of dishonesty, because sensation is, as mentioned according to APA, is the process of experience of perceiving through the senses. So how can my senses, for example, sense that someone is dishonest, or as many say, positive or negative energy, vibes, and so on? To have or feel a sensation such as pain, tingle, or itch is not to perceive anything. Sensations are not perceptible objects of any kind, for objects, worldly denizens, perceived exist whether perceived or not. By contrast, as is often remarked, sensation cannot exist unfelt. There is nothing odd about this, and to conceive of it as constituting a special ontological mode is to make a metaphysical mystery out of a grammatical molehill. Rather, it is just an obscure way of saying that for a person to have a sensation is for the person to feel a sensation, that there is no difference between having a sensation or feeling a sensation. Interesting. So here reference 2 says, for a curious anomaly, however, see Norman Malcolm's discussion of distraction of attention from a pain. This can be viewed as a singularity in the mathematical sense, in which 0 is a singularity in the grammar of sensation. So, feeling here does not signify a form of perception as it does in the sentence, I felt a penny in my pocket, or I felt the cold wind on my cheek. So what's happening here is a sensation, so sensations that are distinguished from objects of perception, and having sensations and feeling sensations. So there seems to be an association and disassociation phenomena at play, at times at least. The penny and the wind exist whether one feels them or not. But the pain in one's tooth and the itch in one's foot can be said to exist only insofar as one feels or has them. The opaque and unfamiliar sentence, a sensation exists or there is a sensation, means no more than someone has a sensation. Aches, cramps, tickles, itches, and tingles are various kinds of sensation. One has a headache only if one's head aches. One has an itch only if some part of one's body itches. So it is no surprise that there is a toothache only if someone's tooth aches, nor is there anything remarkable about there being no such thing as one's tooth aching and one not feeling anything. So what the authors are saying here is a headache and a toothache are an interaction between the body, the organ, and also the individual that is sensing this pain. However, on the other hand, if there is no toothache, there's nothing extraordinary of this pain not existing. And the reason they mention this, I'm not exactly sure. Maybe they'll expand on this a bit further. So if one feels nothing, then one's tooth does not ache. Similarly, one has an itch in one's foot only if one's foot itches. If one feels nothing, then one's foot is not itching, and one does not have an itch in one's foot. A sensation, unlike an object perceived, is as it is felt to be, and this too is altogether unmysterious. It is no more than an obscure way of emphasizing the fact that we assign no sense to such forms of words as a felt, his toothache getting worse. Oh, A felt his tooth getting worse, although it wasn't. His toothache seemed to hurt more, although in fact it didn't. Or the pressure on A's foot hurt more, but it didn't hurt him more. And it is evident why we assign no meaning to such sentences. Okay. Sensations and their bodily location. So what I've gathered so far is that, using the example of pain, it only exists within the body and therefore the mind of the individual, whereas the pain, once pressure is applied, for example, once pressure is applied on the foot, the pain is only perceived to be painful once a conscious experience is being played out. And I spoke about this in the past, of how conscious experience is something none of us can deny, and in fact it has to exist in the first place along with the concept of space and time. So I just feel it's some unnecessary elongation of this particular outlining and definition of pain, but let's see where this goes. Sensations and their bodily location. Sensations have a bodily location. It always makes sense to ask, where does it hurt? And the answer specifies some part of the body. Sensations are felt in one's arm or leg, head or toe, but not felt with an organ of perception. So here semantics, of course, step into play. For instance, if I was to say I felt pain in my arm, is what seems to be the conventional expression, as compared to I felt pain with my arm. So as I mentioned, there's an association and disassociation going on here, but here it seems when we say there's pain in my arm, that's direct association. And if I say there's pain with my arm, that is a disassociation with respect to the arm not being, the pain not being within said arm, but the pain being outside of the personal arm. Sounds probably confusing and complex, but that's just how this type of philosophy is panning out at the moment. It is a confusion to suppose, as John Saul does, that the pain in the foot is literally in the physical space of the brain, that the brain forms a body image, and pains, like all bodily sensations, are parts of the body image. And this is from Rediscovery of the Mind. Okay. Pressure on the brain causes sensations. Pressure on the brain causes sensations, but these are known as headaches. One does not have a pain in the foot, a toothache, or stomach ache in the brain or in the physical space of the brain. Further, a headache, although it is a pain in the head, is not in the head, as the brain is in the head. Opening up the head will reveal a brain, but not a pain. One can take a brain, but not a pain out of a skull. So when we speak about pain, it's possibly localized in a specific lobe of the brain. And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's the medial or temporal lobe when it comes to pain and sensation. However, we do not say that there's pain in my brain. We say there's pain in my head, headache. Although if there is a pain in your brain, it's most likely a stroke or a lesion of some type. So far makes sense. The sentences, he has a pain and a brain in his head, and I have an eyelash and an itch in my eye, are seleptic. Seleptic, which means compare. Synaptic means a figure of speech in which a word is applied to two others of which it grammatically suits only one. For example, neither they nor it is working. Synapsis. Right, okay, interesting. Compare, I have a penny and a hole in my pocket. Both are located in the pocket, but one can be taken out where the other one can be sewn up. That is why what have you got in your mouth? 32 teeth and a toothache is a joke. The logical grammar of pain in the head, location of a sensation, is unlike that of a penny in the box, location of a material object, and unlike that of a party in the garden, location of an event. However, what I would say is common is the spatio-temporal aspect here. Of course, one would feel no sensation were the brain not functioning appropriately, but that does not mean that they felt either in or by the brain. Right. The subject of pain is the human being or animal that manifests it, not his mind or brain. It's a manifestation of pain. Question is, can pain be avoided? And is the absence of pain joy? Or is the absence of pain just simply numbness? The subject or bearer of pain, i.e. the item that has a pain, is a human being who manifests being in pain in the grimaces, groans, or screams, not his mind or his brain. The subject of itches or tickles is he who manifests having an itch or a tickle in scratching or rubbing the part of his body that itches or tickles. His foot may itch or tickle, but the foot does not have an itch or a tickle. If someone's tooth aches, it is he who suffers, not the tooth. Right, so it's in a sense where your body and its parts are contingent with respect to the sensation of pain. So when you have pain in your head, pain in your stomach, that is simply because your stomach is attached to your body, which therefore is attached to your mind. So what they're saying is actually pain that is suffered by you, not exactly the stomach. Don't agree here, because we know, for example, that there are receptors on the skin, proprioceptors, that sense pain and are able to give us the sensation of pain, and to a degree a perception of where the pain may be a perception to localize the pain and where it might be. So that doesn't really make sense. In any case, if his leg hurts, it is he who is in pain and not his leg. We can see the pain in his face, for although the pain may be in his leg, it is he who expresses pain in his grimaces, demeanor, and groans. We tend the leg, but we console the person, the human being. The criterion of pain location is the behavior of the subject of pain. Logical differences between pain in the knee and penny in the box. The location of pain is given by the behavior of the subject of pain. His pain is located wherever he sincerely says it is. If when asked where it hurts, he points to his knee and assuages or nurses it, then his knee hurts, not his brain. So in a sense, when there's pain in your knee, you seek to heal your knee, not your brain. But of course, to have a pain in one's knee is not in respect of the spatial locative in at all, like having a penny in a box. The latter use of the locative spatial preposition allows substitution of inside. The penny is inside the box. But to have a pain in one's knee does not mean that one has a pain inside one's knee. The box contains the penny, but the painful knee does not contain the pain. If the penny is in the box, it must be smaller than the box. But pains are neither smaller nor larger than, nor yet the same size as the part of the body that hurts. I disagree there, because there are pains that could be unbearable. For instance, nerve pain, bone pain, eye pain, so on and so forth. So I don't agree here actually. And this penny in the box equivalent with pain in the knee is just very, very reductive. The penny that is inside the box can also be taken out of it, but the pain in the knee cannot intelligibly be taken out of it, only stopped. That's what I was thinking. That's why this is a false equivalent. If the box is taken to London, then the penny is in London. But if the person goes to London, it does not follow that the pain is in London. It is the person whose knee hurts that is in London, but the pain has not moved. It's a good point. Again, the reason is clear. There is a penny in the box, specifies a spatial relation between two independent objects, but the objectual form of "there is a pain in my knee" is misleading, for it does not specify a relation between two independent objects, a pain and a knee, any more than "I have a pain" specifies a relation of ownership between me and pain. So the author for reference 5 says the following. In this respect, among others, "I have a pain in my knee" is grammatically akin, meaning similar to "I have a crease in my shirt." However, whereas "I have a crease in my shirt" does not imply that I am creased, let alone that I am in crease, "I have a pain in my knee" does not imply that I am in pain. Similarly, if you hurt my leg, you hurt me, but if you crease my shirt, you don't crease me. Referred pains and phantom pains. There is an interesting concept and studies done by Ramachandran. It's called the phantom limb, and he has this box with a mirror. Very fascinating experiment. Inshallah, I'll cover that at some point as well. So-called phantom pains are not pains which seem to be in one's amputated limb. If one's limb is in the disposal bin, it is not there that one puts when asked where it hurts. Rather, they are pains felt outside the body in the phantom limb, where the limb still seems to the patient to be. The patient has a hallucination of the presence of the absent limb. It feels to the patient just as if the limb is still there, and as if the pain from which he suffers is located there. It is not the character of the pain that enables one to say where it hurts. That is, one's ability to say where it hurts is not dependent on the felt character of phenomenal features of the pain. If I say that I have pain in my foot, that my foot hurts, that is not because I felt a foot indicative sensation of pain that informed me, as it were, of the location of the pain. Our normal ability to locate pains is non-evidential. There is nothing mysterious about this. We have a natural inclination to associate the part of our body that hurts, and we learn to point to the part that hurts. Interesting. So now the author is discussing the characteristic of pain and how sensation of pain is not exactly a case where you can move around this pain in terms of external space. For example, you have pain in London and you decide to go New York or Cairo, that pain still remains in, for example, your leg. So often enough, there are external experiences of the body in and of itself, such as phantom pain, otherwise known as phantom limb. So, subhanAllah, it's pretty interesting how human beings can have these faculties and spend an entire lifetime trying to understand the characteristics, the nature, the origin, and hear an explanation of pain in terms of, is it the mind, is it the brain, is it the part of the body, and not just pain, examples of itches as well and aches. So this actually reminded me of an ayah from Surah Al-Mulk, which I would love to share. And the ayah is from 22 to ayah 23. So that would be chapter 67, ayah 22 to 23. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أفمن يمشي مكبا على وجهه أهدى أمن يمشي سويا على صراط مستقيم. قل هو الذي أنشأكم وجعل لكم السمع والأبصار والأفئدة قليلا ما تشكرون. So this approximates to English as, is then one who walks headlong with his face groveling better guided, or one who walks evenly on a straight way? Say, it is he who has created you and made you grow and made for you the faculties of hearing, seeing, feeling and understanding. Little thanks it is ye give. So just by reading this and looking at comments by Abdullah Yusuf Ali. So going to footnote number 5580 here. The man of probability is the man who walks evenly on a straight way, his feet guided by Allah's light and his heart sustained by Allah's mercy. The man who chooses evil grovels with his face down in paths of darkness, stumbling on the way and in constant distrust and fear, the fear of evil. The two kinds of men are poles apart, although they live on the same earth, see the same signs, and are fed with the same mercies from Allah. Interesting. Footnote number 5581, like Ibrahim trying to guide his unbelieving father Azar. 5582, the teacher is asked to draw constant attention to Allah, the source of all growth and development, the giver of the faculties by which we can judge and attain to higher and higher spiritual dignity, and yet, such is our self-will, we use our faculties for wrong purposes and thus show our ingratitude to Allah. So think of it this way, right? We've been speaking about pain, sensations and so on. How about those individuals in, for instance, Gaza, Congo, Kashmir, Xinjiang, the prisons in the Arab speaking countries, those who have been jailed unjustly and being treated mercilessly. Would all of this be of interest to them? Or is this simply a case where Western educated academics sit down and just ponder on these type of ideas? Because irrespective of how pain is to be perceived and how it's to be localized, and the claim here that normal ability to locate pain is non-evidential, what is evidential is that pain exists, and all of this is at the behest of the unjust, corrupt bankers and lobbyists that are looking to not only gain profit but also constantly have control and corrupt human beings. And yes, as always, it's those people. Sensations have degrees of intensity, but not of clarity. They have phenomenal qualities and are linked to inclinations to behave. Sensations have degrees of intensity. They may be excruciatingly painful, or a mere twingle or tickle. One's scalp may be intolerably itchy or merely mildly irritating. Sensations may wax or wane, becoming more or less intense. Unlike perceptions, they do not have degrees of clarity. One does not have a pain clearly and distinctly as one may hear a cry clearly and distinctly. Sensations have phenomenal qualities such as burning, stinging, gnawing, piercing, dull, or throbbing pains. They may be caused internally or externally. They are typically linked with felt inclinations to behave, for example, to scratch and itch, to assuage pain, to laugh when tickled. Assuage means to relieve pain. So sensations may be a momentary, as is a twinge, or prolonged, like the pains of childbirth. But they do not persist through periods of loss of consciousness. One does not feel pain when one is unconscious. The time of the commencement of a sensation is when the subject feels the sensation, and the criterion for his feeling the sensation is his behavior and what he says. Hence, it is misguided to suppose, as Libet does, that the subject might refer the sensation to an earlier time than that at which it actually occurs. So, assigning an abstract concept such as pain and the real world description and phenomena of sensation whether it's prolonged or whether it's short, it's still something that is very much disagreed on. So what does Lebate have to say? I'm quite interested. This is reference number 6. So Libete's time on theory holds that number 1, after a decade achievement of neural adequacy for awareness, there is an automatic subjective referral of the experience backwards in time to approximate the delivery time of the stimulus. Number 2, the initial cortical response, primary evoked potential at S1 cortex to the fast specific lemniscal projection sensory message serves as a timing signal for this backward referral. The experience would thus be subjectively antedated and would appear to the subject to occur without the substantial neural delay required for its production. B. Lebay, conscious subjective experience versus unconscious mental functions. Right. This is misconceived since the sensation does not appear to the subject to occur before it actually occurs. It occurs when the subject feels it. Interesting. Interesting perspective. Sensations belong to the category of passivity of undergoings. Sensation also belongs to the category of passivity. Having or feeling a sensation is an undergoing, whether suffered or enjoyed. One can, of course, bring it about that one feels a certain sensation, but there are no voluntary sensations, only voluntary inflicted or produced ones. While people may be more or less skillful at perceiving certain things, they cannot be more or less skillful at feeling sensations, only more or less susceptible to having them. However, I guess one can be what these days people would call stoic and not let that pain or that sensation of pain become emotive, and rather than moaning and groaning, just consistently fight through it and eventually, get what needs to be done at the end of it. Because at the beginning of our life, we have absolutely no idea. However, the funny thing is when we are born, we come out the womb, more often than not, children, of course, cry. Now, how would you explain that? Okay, the mother's going through the prolonged experience of pain, and the sensation of pain remains. And of course, there are manifestations such as PTSD for the mother at times, even depression. So, that aside, children, once they are born, they have zero ability and no intelligence with regards to perception and sensation of pain. And an ayah of the Qur'an that I have mentioned in the past, that I would like to mention again, is from Surah An-Nahl, verse number 78. Okay. Yeah, verse number 78. So, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والله أخرجكم من بطون أمهاتكم لا تعلمون شيئا وجعل لكم السمع والأبصار والأفئدة لعلكم تشكرون. This approximates to English as, it is he who brought you forth from the wombs of your mothers when ye knew nothing, and he gave you hearing and sight and intelligence and affections, and that ye may give thanks to Allah. It's quite powerful. There's many angles that one can explore, but certainly the one I'm trying to not exactly draw a parallel here, but simply sharing my thoughts and some insights into how understanding the philosophy of neuroscience springs to mind these types of ayah. So Abdullah Yusuf Ali in his footnote 2112 says, literally hearts are considered the centers of affections, and an Arabic idiom of intelligence also. We should also therefore give thanks to Allah, not to imaginary deities or powers or forces. So I'll let you interpret that. So, in terms of Lebade's time-on theory, I don't agree with it entirely, but it's a fascinating perspective here. So, sensations belong to the category of the hedonic. Sensations belong to the category of the hedonic, that is, they may be pleasant or unpleasant. Unsurprisingly, we have a richer vocabulary for pain and unpleasant sensations than for pleasant ones. They disturb our well beings and optimal functioning, and their characterization is significant for diagnostic purposes. Sensations also belong to the category of passivity. Having having or feeling a sensation is an undergoing whether suffered or enjoyed. One can of course bring it about that one feels a certain sensation, but there are no voluntary sensations, only voluntary inflicted or produced ones. While people may more or less skillful at producing certain things, they cannot be more or less skillful at feeling sensations, only more or less susceptible to having them. So for me to repeat that was because I just thought of pain in the context of a more intimate setting. So is that pain that is being enjoyed because it's sensed by the so-called organs and skins? Sorry, skin is an organ. So is that pain that is enjoyable by virtue of the organ, or is it because the idea of this pain becoming enjoyable and pleasurable by virtue of not the actual action and sensations, but by virtue of what the action and sensation signify? To be more sensitive in this respect is not to be better at feeling pains or tickles. Hence, there is no such thing as learning to have a sharper or more accurate sensations. Indeed, although there are sharp sensations, they are not more discerning ones, and there are no accurate or inaccurate, correct or incorrect sensations. So my idea and my sensation of pain, for example, is not deemed incorrect compared to yours, because it's purely subjective according to what these authors have so far outlined. True, but I think when pain is then directly associated with an event or a person, then you're definitely muddying the waters. For example, someone can feel the sensation of pain when their favorite football team loses a match. Now, that pain, if you ask me personally, is not pain. It's the delusion that exists in one's mind that their football team winning or losing has a direct correlation with their joy and pain, and even suffering because they gamble as well, and so on and so forth. There is an interaction, no doubt, but I would not say that is a correct classification of the sensation of pain, where again someone's team has lost a football match. But one may learn to describe one's sensations better and enrich one's descriptive vocabulary. There are tactile illusions, such as the cutaneous rabbit illusion. Here, one has the illusion that one is being touched at equal distances all the way up one's arm, while in fact one is touched, for example, 5 times at the wrist, twice near the elbow, and 3 times in the shoulder. But it is not an illusion that one feels a sequence of sensations equally distributed along the length of the arm. It seems to one as if one is being touched at 10 different locations, but it does not seem to one as if one has 10 sequential sensations distributed along the length of one's arm. one really does have such sensations. However, a person who has had his leg amputated and has a phantom pain does not seem to have a pain in his foot, for there is no such thing as seeming to have a pain. So there is no second guesses of pain. Either you have it or you don't. Nor, as we have seen, can one say that he has a pain in which seems to be in his foot either. Rather, he really has a pain which seems to be where his foot would have been. One might characterize it as a pain location hallucination. Interesting. So, how I would summarize and create a focal point of my understanding is sensation of pain is subjective, subject to time and space and location. Space, of course, where you're existing, time, which is needed for process, let's say P1, pain 1 to happen, and location is P2, the exact location of the pain. So, for example, if I was to injure my hand in my house, then that is not the location of pain per se, that is the space and the time, i.e., the event of the pain, which I recall, and I then localize the pain. Is it on the wrist? Is it one of the knuckles? So on and so forth. And the nature of that pain may be extremely painful for me, but for someone who's an experienced boxer or a construction worker, they are probably immune to such pains. So just like in football, for example, I remember when I used to play football almost every day for hours and hours, I would injure my ankle and rarely my knee. I would have a lot of scratches on my skin. Now at the time it wasn't painful, but after the football match, after a shower, it would be quite painful by virtue of me moving my ankle, the swelling, and so on and so forth. Now, me detaching my ankle, as the authors mentioned here, doesn't necessarily define said pain. That ankle has an association with, of course, my body and my nerves and my entire nervous system, and it has an association of the causal reasons as to why that pain was produced and to a degree prolonged in the first place, i.e., slight tackle, bad tackle, so on and so forth. So it's a fascinating aspect. This is the first time I'm reading this, mind you. However, the next section here on perception is something I did come across earlier and managed to read that portion because I was more interested with perception. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, moving on to perception. What a perceptual organ is. Of the five senses, four, namely sight, hearing, taste, and smell, involve the use of specific sense organs. One sees with one's eyes, not with one's brain. Just as one hears with one's ears, tastes with one's tongue and a palate, and smells with one's nose. Excuse me. The expression with one's here indicates the organ that is used in exercising the faculty in question. The sense in which it is used is clarified by drawing attention to the fact that one brings one's eye not some other part of the body, to a keyhole in order to see through it. That in order to hear better, one puts a hand behind one's ear and cocks it or brings one's ear closer to the source of the sound. That in order to smell, one sniffs and brings one's nose closer to the odorous object to smell it better. And in order to taste, one licks the object or bites off a piece of it and chews it in one's mouth. So it seems to be a procedural and sequential situation we're dealing with here. Tactile perception, however, has no special organ. Perceiving something by feeling may involve almost any part of the body, or indeed the body as a whole. So when I came across this aspect of the philosophy of perception in the context of neuroscience, an ayah from Surah Al-Hajj really affected me. And it's not just one ayah, it's actually a couple of them, so we will cover that inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فكأين من قرية أهلكناها وهي ظالمات فهي خاويات على عروشها وبئر معطلة وقصر مشيد أفلم يسيروا في الأرض فتكون لهم قلوب يعقلون بها أو آذان يسمعون بها فإنها لا تعمى الأبصار ولكن تعمى القلوب التي في الصدور ويستعجلونك بالعذاب ولن يخلف الله وعده وإن يوما عند ربك كألف سنة مما تعدون. Sadaqallahu al-Azim. So in English, this approximates to how many populations have we destroyed which were given to wrongdoing? They tumbled down on their roofs, and how many wells were lying idle and neglected, and castles lofty and well built? Do they not travel through the land, so that their hearts and minds may thus learn wisdom, and their ears may thus learn to hear? Truly, it's not their eyes that are blind, but their hearts, which are in their breasts. Yet they ask thee to hasten on the punishment, but Allah will not fail in His promise. Verily, a day in the sight of thy Lord is like 1,000 years of your reckoning. So for me, chapter 22, verse 46, truly it is not their eyes that are blind, but their hearts which are in their breasts. This answers the claim, in my humble opinion. One may feel the shape or size of a thing with one's hands, its thickness or sharpness with one's fingers, the solidity of the door with one's shoulder, the warmth of a bath towel with one's cheek. One may feel the slipperiness of the ground by walking across it, the viscosity of a liquid by stirring it, the elasticity of an object by pulling it, its movability or immovability by pushing it, and the weight of an object by lifting or carrying it. The brain, however, is not an organ of perception, even though, of course, one cannot see, hear, taste, smell, or feel anything unless one's brain is functioning appropriately. The way I like to put it is that the brain perceives and the heart interprets. The senses are cognitive faculties. The perceptual powers are cognitive faculties in the sense that by their exercise we can acquire knowledge of objects and the qualities of events and the characteristics and of states of affairs that obtain in our environment. Because the senses are cognitive faculties, they are bound up by the endeavor to attain knowledge. And since they are not infallible cognitive faculties, they are conceptually linked with success and failure. One can try to perceive and attempt to discern better. One may decide to look, smell, or taste and do so carefully or carelessly. There may be success, failure, and error, unlike the case of sensation. That is, one may perceive, fail to perceive, or misperceive. Goes back to the correct and incorrect sensations. So perception can be, according to the authors here, a misperception. I suppose an example that can be utilized here is the phenomena of a mirage, the optical illusion. There's water on the ground, but due to the activity of the light being hit on the ground from a certain distance and how we perceive it, that's something that can be misperceived. Another example is mainstream news and mainstream doctors, mainstream experts. The successful upshot of perceptual activities such as looking, feeling, sniffing or scenting, tasting or sampling, and listening is seeing, feeling, smelling, tasting, or hearing, more generally recognizing, discerning, detecting, or distinguishing perceptibilia. These verbs, like perceives that, are sometimes a little misleading, called achievement verbs or success verbs, signaling the successful upshot of perception. More soberly, they are factive verbs, inasmuch as if one perceives, example given, sees or hears, recognizes or detects that things are so, then things are in fact as one perceives them to be. If one finds out that things are not as one says one perceives them to be, then one must withdraw one's claim to have perceived that things are thus and fall back upon the qualified utterances. It seemed to me just as if, so on and so forth. I thought, so on and so forth. Or it visually appeared to me, and so on. Of course, verbs of perception need not take a noun clause, that, such and such, as the grammatical object. They take names of perceptibilia or of perceptual qualities as their objects. These may be of many categorically different kinds of things and non-things like holes or gaps. So as I mentioned earlier, linguistics plays a key role, especially in the philosophical discourse when it comes to science and neuroscience. So factive verb, achievement verbs, they are integral when describing perception as compared to a noun clause, which is not exactly necessary, according to the authors here. Unlike having sensations, one can be more or less skillful at perceiving. One can to some extent be trained in the exercise of one's perceptual powers and acquire a trained eye or ear and a discriminating palate. Just as the liability to sensation is linked to possible pleasure and pain, the powers of perception are linked to possible pleasure and displeasure, to the pleasant and unpleasant. So perception gives us an idea of possibilities. How do we know that? Is that a priori or a posteriori? I would argue it's a priori. However, the forethought is a priori. The motivation and the reactions are a posteriori, of course. We often take pleasure in seeing, hearing, feeling, smelling, or tasting things that are sometimes disgusted, horrified, or revolted by what we perceive. One distinction between perceptual knowledge acquisition and other forms of acquisition of information is precisely that perceiving can be pleasant or unpleasant. There is a sense in which the exercise of the sense faculties is not voluntary. So senses are not voluntary. Interesting. Okay. One cannot choose to hear a loud noise in one's vicinity or to see a salient object in one's visual field, to feel the heat in a hot room, or to taste the sweetness of the liqueur one has just sipped. One can only block one's ears, close one's eyes, leave the room to escape the heat and refuse another sip. So these are extraneous events, essentially out of our control. In another sense, the perceptual faculties can be exercised at will. The senses of sight is bounded up with looking for, looking at, watching, scanning, surveying, observing, and inspecting, all of which may be voluntary activities. So too the sense of hearing is bound up with voluntary listening for a sound or to a sequence of sounds. One does not voluntarily feel the heat of the day, but one may voluntarily feel for something in one's pocket and voluntarily stretch out one's hand to feel the thermal quality or texture of a thing within one's reach. So now here the authors are linking the ability to exercise voluntary action of perception and that perception which happens without us doing it on a voluntary basis. For instance, you observe a car crash, the noise, the smell, and the visuals are out of your control. However, the after effects that eventually grow on you do have a lasting effect. So the sounds eventually become traumatic, possibly, but initially they are indicating a sense of danger, threat, and harm, and possibly death. And then the smell is that of oil leaking or the tires that have screeched the road. And the sight in and of itself can be horrifying at times as well. So crushed doors, bonnet is crushed, engine is completely destroyed, the side of a car is completely gone, the tires are all over the place, so on and so forth. So in such a situation, is your perception voluntary or involuntary? Well, I would say it lies in behavior, and that would entail reaction. So I take the middle ground in this case. Possession of a sense faculty is manifest in behavior. The sighted are identified by their exercise of the ability to discriminate visible objects and qualities, by their illumination dependent competence in finding their way around without bumping into or falling over things, by their searching for and finding things by looking, by their following things with their eyes and orienting their head and body appropriately, and by their responses to visual stimuli such as lights, glimmers, and flashes. In general, the forms of behavior that manifest possession of a given perceptual faculty consist in relative efficiency in discrimination, recognition, discernment, pursuit of goals, and exploration of the environment. In the case of human beings, in corresponding utterances too. These kinds of behavior in response to visibilia, for example, are logical criteria for a creature seeing things. Neural events in the brain are not. They are inductive correlations with seeing. They presuppose the non-inductive identification of seeing by reference to criterial behavior. So, the authors are saying that the neural events in the brain are not as detailed, meaning they are inductive correlations with seeing. So what we see, there's an inductive reasoning that happens where from that you draw a general conclusion which fits in the criterial behavior that one possesses or is possessed. One does not see anything in one's brain or look for something in the bookcase with one's brain, nor does one see the color of flowers with or in one's brain, but with one's eyes as one looks at the garden. The brain is neither an organ of perception nor a subject of perception. The neural events in the brain are not forms of perceiving behavior, and nothing the brain can do could count as a criterion of its perceiving something in its vicinity. It is the animal that perceives and manifests its perceiving in its behavioral responses to its environment. So I found this aspect interesting as well, because another ayah I would like to share here. And the reason I like to share this particular ayah is because it touches on what the authors are saying regarding to inductive processes which they can't really prove. And this is all philosophical talk really at the end of the day. And to say that the brain is neither an organ of perception neither subject of perception, so it cannot be subjected to perceive X, I think is rather false. And I'll humbly present why I think so. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ومثال الذين كفروا كمثال الذي ينعق بما لا يسمع إلى دعاء ونداء ثم بكم عمي فهم لا يعقلون. صدق الله العظيم. So in English, this approximates to the parable of those who reject faith is as if one were to shout like a goat herd to things that listen to nothing but calls and cries. Deaf, dumb, and blind, they are void of wisdom. So the reason I mention this ayah is because if we were to take everything that the authors have mentioned so far, it would be very difficult to explain a revelation without some type of concretized example in its entirety. There are many incidents in the Qur'an that no one will ever experience, and in fact, if one was to experience them, it would be too fantastical. An example I can give you is of Sulaiman alayhi salam, King Solomon as he's known in the biblical tradition, and the incident where an individual from his court made a huge claim that before you blink your eye, I'll bring the palace of the queen of, at the time, Yemen. And he did that. And the Quran indicates to us that he did that because of the knowledge he had from a book of his time. What's fascinating is how did he manage to bend time, pass through multi-dimensions, and acquire space, and at the same time larger space within a limited time, but yet an infinite amount of teleportation happening. By infinite I mean a number of many events occurred for that massive palace to simply come to present day Sham. So in such a case, we of course take this as revelation and as it is, so we don't question it, because as the Quran states that Allah can question, we, the creation, cannot question Allah, the creator. And it makes sense. At the end of the day, there has to be an authority in place. So I would also like to share what Abdullah Yusuf Ali has to say. So this is from chapter 2, verse 171. From footnote number 171. So he says, in reference to verse 18, chapter 2, where we are told that the rejectors of faith are deaf, dumb, and blind, they will not return to the path. Here the consequences of their not using their senses is that they have no wisdom. In each context, there is just the appropriate deduction. So, subhanAllah, here the philosophers are talking about inductive reasoning. Here, Allah is indicating towards deductive reasoning. So, for those who aren't familiar, inductive reasoning is when there are many components, parts, axioms of an idea, and then you form a general principle around it. Deductive reasoning is where there's a general principle and then you break it up into parts to understand the whole as a result of scrutinizing and exhausting its parts. So, in terms of this ayah, the general wisdom here is not to reject the faith, and don't be like those who reject the faith. Because upon that, your perception is clouded. Because deaf, dumb, and blind is the equivalence given here in this ayah. And interestingly, goatherd is used as an example. Now here the authors are talking about neural events in the brain. They are more inductive with correlations with seeing, right? However, this is based off of the neural activity that occurs in the brain. What about the neural activity that occurs in the heart? What about the vestibular cognition system that allows us to function and analyze space and understand where we are in real time? So much of this is, I would not say neglected, that would be unfair, but I would say this is pretty much skipped by the authors very conveniently. Consequently, to speak, as neuroscientists are prone to do, of the right hemisphere of the brain seeing things is at best a misleading façon de parler. It is similarly misguided to suggest, as Francis Crick does, that in perception what the brain learns is usually about the outside world or about other parts of the body. This is why what we see appears to be located outside us, although the neurons that do the seeing are inside the head. To many people, this is a strange idea. The world is outside their body, yet, in another sense, what they know of is entirely within their head. Of course, if we open up the skull and pick up the signals sent out by a particular neuron, we can often tell where that neuron is located. But the brain we are studying does not have this information. This explains why we do not normally know exactly what our perception and thoughts are taken in our heads. Francis Crick, who discovered the structure of the DNA, he also thought that aliens came to planet Earth to breed, i.e., created humans, stuck through land, and flew back. Panspermia. Despite such incredible work in the field of DNA and genetics, he decided to believe in that nonsense. What a sad life. This is confused, since in perception the brain learns nothing. It is a human being whose brain it is that perceives and learns something in perceiving. False is the soul that is being tailored and it's being sharpened. As clearly this is a godless essay we're reading so far. That would only make sense in a godless discourse. What we see does not appear to be located outside us. What we see is necessarily located outside our body, unless we are looking at ourselves in a mirror, or at our limbs or thorax, which are neither inside nor outside our body, but part of it. The neurons without which we would not see anything are located in our heads, but of course, it is not those neurons that see or that do the seeing, any more than the cylinders of a car that do 70 miles per hour. Right, but it's still functional. Neurons are a necessity and contingent to the human heart, brain, of which is contingent to the soul. Because everything we do through our senses, our perception system, that will determine how we conduct ourselves in this life, and that will obviously determine our afterlife. So that's the, I wouldn't say dualism, but these are the two issues we are dealing with at the moment. There is no sense in which the world is inside anyone's head, and it is a conceptual error to suggest that what we know of the world is inside our heads. We know that the earth is spherical, but what we know, namely that the earth is spherical, is not in our heads. Or anywhere else. And finally, it is misleading to say that we do not know where in our heads our perceptions take place, since our perceptions do not take place in our heads at all. Neuroscientists apart, we do not know which array of cells is causally responsible for our being to perceive whatever we perceive. Our perception, i.e., our perceiving whatever it is we perceive, does not take place in our heads, but takes place wherever we are when we perceive what we perceive. Excuse me. So they're saying, okay, perceiving whatever we perceive, that doesn't take place in our heads. So therefore, it's not entirely concretized in our brain. For example, I can't point to love in your brain. I can point to how your brain responds to something that it loves, because love is, I wouldn't say arbitrary, but it's defined subjectively. For instance, you may love dark chocolate, many people don't. So, an area in your brain will instantly light up when you taste, smell, and just see dark chocolate. Whereas the individual who does not like the dark chocolate, their brain areas may not be as lit up and less active. So, that just doesn't help at all, unfortunately. Perceiving is an epistemic relation between a perceiver and an object perceived. And since the objects we perceive are not in our heads but in our environment, the supposition that perceiving takes place in one's head makes no more sense than the supposition that Jack's running faster than Jill takes place in Jack. The questions, where did you last hear Beethoven's Ninth, or where did you see Jack, can be answered by in the Sheldonian Theatre if one saw Jack at the concert, but not by 4 inches behind my left eye. Yeah, so goes to my earlier point, space is necessary to fully formulate and therefore define to the fullest extent perception. So next section is perception as the causation of sensations' primary and secondary qualities. So it is important not to conflate perception with sensation. A long tradition in philosophy as well as in psychology and neuroscience assumed that perceiving something characteristically involves having sensations. The root of this conception lie in the 17th and 18th century conception of perception as the causation of ideas or impressions in the mind resultant upon the impact of stimuli on our nerve endings and the consequent excitation of the animal spirits in the nerves. Damage to nerve endings by cutting, burning, etc. causes ideas of pain. The impact of light on the retina or of sound waves on the eardrum causes ideas of color or of sound. Ideas of pain and ideas of color and sound were held to stand on the same level. They are all produced by the action of things upon our nerve endings. Insofar as neuroscientists today conceive of perception as a matter of the reception of sensations, they are conforming to a venerable, although confused, tradition. We shall revert to this issue after we have clarified the source of this confusion. So now they are going to obviously discuss the nature of conception of perception, so how perception is conceived, what can be said in terms of perception and conception, i.e., what can be put in that category. So, a complement to the conception of perceiving as a reception of ideas or impressions was the thought originating with Galileo and further developed by Descartes, Boyle and Locke, that just as the sensation of pain is a subjective modification of the mind caused by an object's deleterious impact upon our nerve endings, and it is not the apprehension of a quality of pain in the object, so too the sensation of color, sound, smell, taste, warmth, and cold are merely subjective modifications of the mind, and not the apprehension of objective qualities of perceptibilia. Objects as they are independently of our perception Objects as they are independently of our perception of them were thought to have only primary qualities of extension, shape, size, solidity, motion, or rest. The secondary qualities of color, sound, smell, taste, and thermal, as well as further tactile qualities as they are objectively, are merely powers of objects to cause ideas of color, sound, etc. in us. So the question is, do these objects that cause perception have some type of inherent power? For example, the flame that burns the tree. Does the flame have a power that is free of space and time and is independent of causality? Whilst the tree, on the other hand, is less in power, therefore is unable to fight off the heat or protect itself or insulate itself. So objectivity of the nature of objects is certainly of importance here. As we experience them, they are no more than ideas or sensations in our minds. According to this conception, the world as we perceive it is dramatically different from the world as it is in itself. Perceiving an object was conceived of as having an array of partly unrepresentative ideas of the object caused in one's mind as a consequence of the activities of the brain. What we apprehend in perception is not the object itself, but rather the ideas it causes in us. Ideas of primary qualities represent objective qualities of the objects we perceive, but ideas of secondary qualities do not. This conception became embedded in the foundation of scientific conception of reality and the psychological and neuroscientific conception of perception. So primary qualities of objects were simply taken as the main forms that will act as the primary function of perception on behalf of the perceiver. And so this and secondary qualities don't. So this concept, according to the authors, eventually was embedded in the foundations of scientific conception of reality and psychological neuroscientific conception of perception. Right, but I partly agree. I disagree because Thomas Kuhn speaks about paradigm shifts and the constant shift in development. So if primary qualities were taken, secondary qualities were neglected, maybe the secondary qualities have not yielded the results as expected, and moving forward there might be situations where secondary qualities will eventually yield results that are desired. So the aspect that I do agree with is that yes, a perception of this object, you and I will agree on three things. It's white, it's a pencil, and it's fairly light. We will even agree on the function. So we agree on the form, we will agree on the function. It's used to write. It must be charged by nature, so it can be eventually used. This is quite a valuable item, so I must take care of it. Now the secondary qualities are what exactly? Secondary qualities possibly, in my view, are the intricate circuitry that exists inside this device. How do these circuitries contribute to my perception or reduce sensations. For example, for those of you who probably have a PlayStation 5 or Xbox One, controllers, when you're using a controller with certain aspects of a game you're playing, let's say you're playing Red Dead Redemption 2 shooting game, if you're shooting fast or shooting slow, the controller will react in such a way that will produce a type of haptic sensation where you can feel the controller as if it's an actual gun. But that controller is not the primary quality of the gun, which is the sound and the recoil, but it's a secondary quality that is being taken into account. Why? Because that's virtual. I can record as many recordings as I want of an old gun, for example, a Lancaster repeater, but the recordings of a Lancaster repeater is not the same as a controller vibrating. It's a situation where I have to personally experience a Lancaster repeater, but before I can experience, I need some expertise. Not necessarily a long form course or go through many months of training, but have the expertise of understanding this is the trigger, I need to pull this, there's going to be a recoil, that's the target, so on and so forth. So that is problematic, but at the end of the day, science's job is not to explain the why, it's to explain the how. And that's why science, in particularly neuroscience, for us neuroscientists, it's very difficult. In fact, it's impossible to give an objective, full front answer for any phenomenon. There will always be disagreements and changes in paradigms and new findings and refutations and so on and so forth. So it's this division that is fairly interesting. It is still as firmly entrenched as ever. Kandel, Schwartz, and Jessel introduced their discussion of the sensory systems. And this is quoted from their book, Essentials of Neuroscience and Behavior. Kandel, famous neuroscientist, American, I believe. I quote, "We receive electromagnetic waves of different frequencies, but we perceive colors, red, green, orange, blue, or yellow. We receive pressure waves, but we hear words and music. We come in contact with a myriad of chemical compounds dissolved in air or water, but we experience smells and tastes. Colors, sounds, smells, and tastes are mental constructions created in the brain by sensory processing. They do not exist as such outside of the brain. Therefore, we can ask the traditional question raised by philosophers. Does a falling tree in the forest make a sound if no one is near enough to hear it? Yes, because a tree by nature, once hits the ground, the impact will produce a sound, irrespective of any perceiver that exists. We can say with certainty that while the fall creates pressure waves in the air, it does not create a sound. Sound occurs only when pressure waves from the falling tree reach and are perceived by a living being. Wherever there's trees, there's always going to be living beings anyway. Thus, our perceptions are not direct records of the world around us, but are constructed internally according to innate rules and constraints imposed by the capabilities of the nervous system. Now, I can speak on this for hours, but an interesting area I've been looking at recently is neuroconstructivism. So, neuroconstructivism tries to embed constructivist approaches with how the gene of an individual reacts with their environment. Pardon me, not react, how there is a possible interaction and correlation. And I covered this extensively in the past, and how concepts like embodiment, enselment, ensorcelment, and genetics play a role. So I understand where they're coming from. That if there's no ears, i.e., no organs of perception, will that sound, i.e., pressure waves through the air, impact on the ground? Will it make a sound? But a tree by nature has living beings around it. In fact, this is where the concept of jinn also come into place, because jinn are unseen beings that Allah has created, and it's mentioned numerous times in the Quran. In fact, the last chapter of the Quran. And the Quran therefore concludes with jinn wan nas, jinn and mankind. So if a tree falls, then the jinn will be there to perceive, but then we don't perceive the jinn. However, we know the jinn is there by virtue of the Quran. Yeah, but how do I know if the Quran is true? Try and falsify it. Yeah, but I need to learn Arabic, but science this and my ideas that refute the Quran. In fact, the Quran gives an infallibility test. Come and try and produce a chapter like it, or a line like it, or whatever the case may be. So it's merely impossible at the end of the day to refute the Quran. So when the Quran speaks of jinn, I know for a fact there is a sound being produced because the jinn can also have those causal links with the environment as we do. Of course, they have certain characteristics and features of their being that are enhanced. Not to misconstrue my words here in terms of us being them equal to them, of course not, because in certain cases they have better abilities than us. However, they are kept through a barrier, maybe dimension, maybe portal. Many theories out there. I'll let you imagine how you want for now. So first, it is important to emphasize that this is not an empirical claim or a scientific hypothesis, let alone a scientific theory that can be or has been confirmed experimentally. It is a philosophical or conceptual claim which can be confirmed or disconfirmed only by conceptual investigations and a priori arguments. No scientific experiment could possibly prove that grass, as it is in itself, is not really green, but only appears to us to be so. That sugar is not really sweet, but only seems so. Or that ice is not cold, but merely strikes us thus. All scientific experiment can do is explain the processes by which we are able to perceive the colors, how we are able to perceive colors, sounds, and thermal qualities, and investigate whether other species of animals have the same perceptual discriminatory powers. Yeah, because at the end of the day, we are limited beings. So it's very silly to simply expect human beings to know everything about the world around us. That is merely impossible. It cannot demonstrate that things that we apprehend to be colored are actually lacking in color, or that things we apprehend as making sounds do not really do so. What it can demonstrate is that former objects reflect light of a certain wavelength that affects our eyes and brains in such ways, as a result of which we see what we call their color, and it can demonstrate that the latter objects cause sound waves that affect our ears and brain in certain ways which exercise our auditory faculty. Of course, no sound is heard unless sound waves reach the ears of a hearer, but it does not follow that there was no sound to be heard, or that trees fall silently to the earth in the absence of hearers. Kind of agrees with what I've mentioned a few moments ago. Scientific discovery in no way demonstrates that grass is not really green or that cellos do not have a rich and mellow sound. Cellos do not have a rich and mellow sound. It does not establish that there are no colors in the absence of observers or sounds independently of listeners. To establish whether that thesis is correct or incorrect turns on a careful conceptual analysis of the meaning of secondary quality predicates, on how these expressions are taught, learnt, and explained, how they are applied, and what follows logically from their application. Okay, interesting. Whether being colored is an objective, non relational property of objects is a matter of meaning. What kind of things can be colored, that is what are intelligible subjects of color predicates, is an a priori logical grammatical question. It needs no science to tell us that it is senseless to ascribe colors to numbers as opposed to numerals, or that what is colored must be extended, or a flash or a point of light. Which of the things that can be colored are actually colored is a contingent matter of fact, to be discovered in experience not by science but by sight. So science can't really explain color until we import said colors. And in the past I spoke about the visual cortex, the V1 striate cortex, and the ocular dominance columns, the stripes like layers that exist in the V1. They are neurons and they process colors in unique ways. So we shall leave it at that, and I will certainly continue from here, because like with any philosophical concept and philosophical video, you need to really engage and grapple and wrestle with the ideas at play. So next time we will understand the second point of the metaphysical applications, or maybe the metaphysical aspects of secondary qualities and its implications within neuroscience. So till next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.